In my spare time, I have a side hustle, which is my YouTube channel called GP on the Move. I make videos for the person I was a year ago. As I was transitioning into the healthcare system in Australia, there were so many things I just didn't understand. The basics, Medicare, PBS, those kind of things. When I start deep diving into something, and then I want to share that with other people so they can save themselves hours and hours of research that I have to go through. So that's pretty much me in a nutshell at the moment. When I was working in Poland, I felt lost because it wasn't really evidence-based medicine. There weren't many guidelines. It was more what I call eminence-based medicine. So someone comes in and it's like, what do we do with him? We'll just ask the most senior doctor around. And if that senior doctor was 80 years old and he gave you advice, he's like, this is what I've been doing for the last 50 years, you would just be expected to do it that way. I didn't really like that culture. So when you said about healthcare systems that are dissimilar, I feel that the system I was in Poland at that time would be very dissimilar from what I do in Australia. Again, when I come into work, I have 7 Internet Explorer windows open, 7 different guideline websites, and I reference them when I'm seeing patients. From a clinical point of view, it wasn't that difficult coming from the UK to Australia. With AHPRA and transferring from the UK, if you are a specialist from the UK, it is relatively easy. They have the competent pathways. For me, I went down the specialist pathway because I'm a UK trained GP. So I'm substantially comparable. That was straightforward. Admittedly, though, I did have a locum agency help me out with that. So they recruited me from the UK to Australia. And they were so helpful, honestly, because you can do it yourself. It will take you a long time and you'll be, filling in forms the wrong way and you have to redo it and that kind of thing. It was interesting when I first came over, the RACGP. So they have these webinars for IMGs. They're very long, 6 hours total. It's interesting that within those webinars, they're like, if you are coming in from the UK, consider getting some help, at least initially, just to get settled in, to go through that whole registration process. They don't overtly advertise and say, use this company, but they're, consider getting help. That is a little bit tricky. Now that I'm here, I understand practices can pay up to $30,000 as a customer to the locum agency. I didn't have to pay anything, but when you're not paying, someone is paying for that service. And so once you kind of come to Australia and you're nice and established, it's much easier. You build up a network of friends and professionals, and they kind of say, hey, there's an opening here. Why don't you apply? Once you're in, it is easier. Interestingly, I was worried about AHPRA causing me issues by going back to the UK and then coming back to Australia. So whilst I was in the UK for 3.5 years, I continued to pay my AHPRA fees. I did not stop paying. I continued to do my RACGP revalidation and send CPD points over to them, just so that once we came back and I knew we were coming back, I could just slide right in. And that's exactly what happened. So I was very grateful. I continued to pay their fees. I consider myself an IMG because my training was in Poland and I did work in Poland for a year. But the good thing about doing your specialty in the UK is that the specialty is substantially comparable to Australia, which means that coming over, I didn't really have to do any exams because in the UK, it was very guideline and protocol driven. And I personally love guidelines so much that I wrote an audiobook with guidelines for GP trainees. Coming to Australia felt easy from a clinical point of view. When I first qualified as a GP, you're stuck in your training practice, seeing the same patients, you get to know them really well. Then I started locuming in the UK to get more experience and working in different practices. I remember my first locum shift, I was terrified because I was like, this is a completely new area. It was a different city, different demographic. I'm like, what are these patients going to come in with? I felt insecure about it. It turned out that patients have the same problems everywhere. That translated to Australia as well. Coming over, again, a lot of trepidation, a bit of an imposter syndrome. What am I doing here? I wasn't trained in Australia. How am I going to manage? And you do. If you're well trained, you learn guidelines, protocols. We're all humans at the end of the day. There are a lot of things that are very different. I remember leaving a shift when I started working in Australia, and I'm like, what does that sound? It sounded like change, like someone was counting money, like counting change. I'm like, what are you guys doing? And they're like, well, we're just counting the money in the cash register. And that was so foreign to me because in the UK, everything is public, a massive public health system. I mean, there are pros and cons, but there was never any exchange of money. And I jumped into a private practice where you're expected to know what a gap is and how much you're going to charge. what Medicare number to use. So that was pretty terrifying for me. I'm a year and a half in, so I have a general understanding of how things are going. I created a video specifically for IMGs coming to Australia about, what is this whole Medicare thing? What does bulk billing mean? A completely foreign concept to me. So yeah, it's a long-winded answer to a simple question. Clinically, it's the same. I feel like if I did go to a country where there's diseases of scarcity, I would struggle. So, third world countries and things. But in the UK and Australia, there's a lot of diseases of plenty. I have done a few videos about that. My most recent video is how much GPs make in Australia. That's something a lot of people ask me. I also did a video about how much kind of your standard GP makes. And when I was leaving, and I was a salaried doctor in the UK, and I was an 8-session salaried doctor, which means that I worked 4 days a week. And that was kind of typically from 8:30 till 5, 6. So within your session, you do your patients, and then you have time allocated for your admin, which is referrals, labs, and that kind of thing. And the session rate was around £11,000 per annum. And that's before tax. And now you have to understand that as a salaried doctor in the UK, you get 6 weeks of paid annual leave, as opposed to being a GP in Australia where you're a 0-hour contractor. So if you go on annual leave, you pay for that. If you're sick and can't work, you pay for that. Even though £88,000 doesn't sound like a lot, you had 6 weeks of annual leave, you had 1 week of study leave, and that's full pay. I also did have an admin session paid for. So even though I was kind of a salary doctor with 8 sessions, one of those sessions wouldn't be seeing patients. It would be my personal admin time where I could do reports, referrals, or to be honest, edit YouTube videos, which is what I did most of the time. I hope my previous employer is not listening to this. But having said that, they were amazing employers. I really loved working there. If we weren't coming to Australia, I would probably stay and become a partner. You get employer superannuation, which you don't get in Australia. You have to pay your own super. So when you factor all of those things in, I feel like you are making a bit more money in Australia. The number that you see when you get your paycheck here in Australia is a lot. And it's a lot of money. And you're like, yeah, what a great idea coming over. But then you're like, and I'm currently creating a video of all the expenses that I have and how much actually goes into my bank account. But put away for tax, I put away 11.5% for what I consider annual leave, because I still want to take at least a few weeks off in the year. And then I also put 10.5% away for SUPA, because I want to maximize my concessional contributions for SUPA. And then I put some money aside for a bit of a school fund for my kids. That's the money I put into my bank account. It's been a topic at home where I discuss with my wife, this is how much I'm making. And she's like, how come there's so little in the joint account? I'm like, well, because I have to put away almost 61% for this and that. There were benefits in the UK of being a salary doctor. And I did prefer that, actually. And sometimes when I speak to doctors at my practice, some of the older doctors are kind of like, oh, I really wouldn't mind a salaried model. I'd have my sick leave and I wouldn't have to work as hard. I'm not sure that's true, but there is that big difference. One of our main priorities financially coming here was to buy a house. We sold our house in the UK. With that down payment, we started looking for houses here in Australia, and absolutely terrified by what's happening in the market at the moment. We started looking for houses 6 months ago, and 6 months later, we're completely outpriced. So we could no longer afford the houses we were looking at. We ended up spending quite a bit to get things going. Now we have our own house, our primary place of residence. Our mortgage is much higher than in the UK, which is just kind of the nature of housing and the housing situation in Australia. So I'm really strict about maxing out my concessional contributions for SUPA. That's non-negotiable. I have access to carry forward contributions because I hadn't been contributing for the last 5 years. And I did have a look on the ATO website, and apparently I can also put in some money for that. So that's going to be our main priority going forward. Now that we've secured a permanent place of residence, we're going to start putting aside, trying to max out those contributions to SUPA. 10.5% is what I said. We also put money aside for the kids and rebuilding our emergency fund because our expenses are higher. We're running at around 5 to 6 months of spending just sitting there. It's not invested in stocks, just in a high interest savings account, ready if we need it.